First of all, the Statistics Department, for which I've been responsible since 2011, is probably the only department that has seen no growth in manpower. And of course, if you do something once every 10 years, it's not something that you can employ permanent staff for, because what do you do then with the staff that you take on? Wait for the next 10 years. So the answer is that there's a huge volume of work at that point every 10th year, which then goes down when they have just the normal statistics that they produce between 10-year censuses. I think the answer has to be, I was asked a question about this by the leader of the opposition in Parliament, and I said that I was planning to make sure that this didn't happen in the next one, which will be in 7 years' time, because I think we need to be in a position to make use of artificial intelligence to do a lot of actually coding of the data that comes in. And I think in 7 years' time, artificial intelligence will be everywhere, and it will be in doing statistics reports as well, I'm sure.
So we've spoken before about the increase in population. Yeah. I believe the figure is at 2022, 5,000 extra people. Yeah. It's been 3 years since then. Has that figure increased?
Yes, the average in the last 3 years is 3,000, so it's actually doubled, and the 5,000 itself was an increase on the figure before, which was 3,750 in the previous decade, you see. So we've seen, and this is net, of course, the 3,000 is not net, it's a gross figure. So, but it will be, in my view, there seems to be when we're looking at a 10-year, we're looking at the first and the last, right? I think if we had a yearly figure, what we see is that it goes steadily up every year. And of course, we are lucky in Gibraltar that in spite of the fact that we've had the COVID and other things that have affected other countries, our economy has recovered quite well to where it was pre-COVID. The government revenue now, for example, before COVID it was 704 million, and we reached last year 800 million. So, but of course, that doesn't mean that the budget can increase infinitely. The density of population can increase infinitely, and therefore we have to do what almost every other country does, which is that they introduce the criteria to ration how many people can come in, and therefore rely on those who will be contributing most in terms of creating new economic activity or meeting the skills. Clearly when we've got specific skills like those of insurance and gaming, which are the biggest earners of tax for the government, the needs of those key industries, which have quite a big turnover of people, have to be met, and therefore they have priority because they really are the engine that keeps our economy going.
So do we know how many people are living in Gibraltar today?
Well, it would be a guess, but I would say probably 2,000 more than the figure of 38,000, so we might now be on 40.
So that's a lot of people for a small place. How does that affect things like healthcare, housing, education? What implications does that have?
The education is the most difficult one, because the only thing you can do until you build a new school is increase the size of the classes. And we all know, people who come from UK here are drawn partly not just by the quality of life, the fact that the station is lower, but because our education compares quite favorably of part of the UK. And that part of that is, of course, that we have smaller classes than they do. So if you've got, a teacher having to teach a class of 30, then probably the product is less good than if they were teaching 15, because the logic is that they can devote much time to each pupil, and the other one has got half the time to each pupil. So if we start importing people, before we get around to building more schools, the only thing that it would be to reduce the quality and the level of our education, because there would be more numbers and their classes would go up, and that's the place that will be most vulnerable, right? In terms of housing, the people that come in, what is happening is that the more people that come in, there's a finite number of houses in the market, and they're already extremely expensive. You know, the average worker in Gibraltar cannot afford to buy in the private market. Most of the people that buy in the private market are in high earnings in the private sector, over 1,000 a week, right? So the effect on the housing will be less, because a lot of people of our own local people, Gibraltarian people, are already cut out of that market, right? And I think in the GHA, look, the building can cope with more people. We haven't got a hospital that has no empty beds, you know. You can always employ more nurses and more doctors. So really, the one that I think is most negatively affected is the quality of the education, if you have to have larger classes. In terms of the GHA, I mean, everything is relative in life, you know, and therefore, by the standards of the UK, our waits are miraculously short. So that's an attraction for somebody coming here, you know. So we actually have better social services and lower taxes than the UK, and therefore anybody who wants to emigrate from the UK to look for a better life for his family is attracted to Gibraltar, because of course the legal system is the same and the language is the same. So it's almost as if we were the most southern tip of the south of England, right? But and we welcome them, because you know we are part of the British family of nations. But what we cannot do is put at risk what we've got by accommodating more people than we can.
Were there any other surprising findings identified in the census?
One very welcome finding is that the number of people over 70 is the one that has had the biggest growth. As you know, I am in that number. I welcome it very much. So now the life expectancy is one of the highest in the world for both men and women. So if you go back in time, when I was born, the life expectancy was 70. The expectancy now is something like 87 for women and 81 for men.
So what does that mean in terms of pensions?
Well, all the pension systems are in trouble, and ours is no exception, but ours is in less trouble than others. I've been involved, now it's under the Chief Minister, but I've been involved for the previous years with it, and therefore, since numbers are my thing, the way I monitor it is that I know that we can continue to provide the levels of pensions in spite of the increase in demand that there will be. But the one thing that people need to understand, that when the pension started, which was in 1945 in the UK, just after the war, and you had a situation where, in effect, children left school at 15, right? They had to work, males had to work until they were 65, so they contributed for 50 years. They retired at 65 and they died at 69. So they paid for 50 years and were paid for 4. Now they start work at 20 after university, they retire at 60. So now the period that they're not contributing is longer out of their lifespan, and the period that they are pensioners is longer. So you've got a situation where, compared to the system that was created initially, which was paid with a surplus because you paid for 50 years, and you got paid for 5 or 6 if you were lucky. Now the numbers are the opposite, and therefore the pensions now are in a situation where they're all in serious trouble. Ours currently has got a fund which is in a slight surplus of about £7 million. The I mean, so, and as you know, there is a commitment to introduce pensions at 60 for men as well as women, which will increase the cost. But we know how to do it, and we are prepared for it. But it has to wait until the final treaty on the EU, because if we were still in the EU and having to pay all the people of the EU that have been in Gibraltar in the 43 years that we were members, we would not be able to pay it.
So how does it work? People are living longer, and yet the government will be reducing the pension for men to 60, the pensionable age rather. So surely the maths don't work out, or do they?
Maths always work out. The answer is quite simple. We had a situation for 43 years when thousands and thousands of EU nationals came to work to Gibraltar. Although our legislation said that you had to work a minimum of 11 years and pay a minimum of 11 years, if you were from the EU, you were entitled to a pension after 1 year. Those pensions, since we left in 21, are only historic. They are no longer growing. So really, in relation to the number of pensioners, eventually, if we had not had Brexit, so at least that's one good thing about Brexit, but if we had not had Brexit, we would have found that the pensioners who were former workers of Gibraltar, now living in one of the 27 member states, would outnumber the pensioners in Gibraltar.
Any other findings, any other demographic trends that could be shared ahead of publication?
Not really. I think it's a continuation of what is happening in other places. That is the aging population and the declining birth rates are happening in Gibraltar, not to the same extent as elsewhere, but it is still there. And the level of people of different religions is going down the same as it is in the rest of Europe. So those trends are no surprise. I mean, because we're Europeans, and what is happening in European society, it's happening in Gibraltar as well.
You mentioned the declining birth rate, and that is something that's happening in countries worldwide. What is Gibraltar doing to incentivize women to have children?
Well, with us, it's not to the same degree, right? And therefore, we are not. Look, the net reproduction rate is 2.1 children per woman, because there are some women that will have none. So you have to have two to replace a father and a mother, right? In places like South Korea, it's 0.75. We are probably in something like 1.9 or 2.
And my last question is, and you kind of touched upon it before, but does the government plan to modernise aspects of future censuses to speed up processing and reduce delays?
Yes, I think it will be inevitable I'm now trying to introduce it in the employment survey, which is an annual collection of statistics, and therefore the experience that we gain with doing it with the employment surveys will be something that will help us to do it when we have the next census, which will be in 7 years' time.